When I was 12, I was mature for my age, so most of my friends were a couple of years older than I was. So one night, a couple of my friends invited me to a party at a place we called the Train Trestle. Everyone was supposed to meet up around midnight and just hang out and maybe have a drink of a couple of wine coolers or something. So I was like, hey, great, sounds awesome, I'll be there. This is on a Friday night, and just to give you some perspective, the Train Trestle was about 3 or 4 miles from my house, and about 2 of those miles was walked through the woods with a train track on one side and woods on the other. There was a small trail maybe 6 feet wide and about 50 yards down the trail. It takes a turn towards the woods, so there are trees and brush between the trail and the tracks. It was thick enough that you could only catch glimpses of the train tracks. I'd been to the Train Trestle many times during the day and always with friends, but tonight I'd be going alone. I waited for my parents to go to bed and snuck out my window headed for the train tracks. It was about a 3/4 moon, so it wasn't terribly dark, and I felt so grown up and free. I get to the trail and start down it. It was a crisp November night, and I enjoyed the cold, so I enjoyed my walk. About halfway down the trail, I thought I heard something that sounded like a rock falling from the tracks. I stopped and tried to look on the tracks, but it was fairly obscured by trees and brush, so I carried on. A minute later, I heard what sounded like footsteps in the gravel on the tracks. I stopped again, mildly alarmed. My first thought was that it was a raccoon or maybe a cat walking on the tracks. I took another step and suddenly heard what sounded like a whistle. I turned again, trying to get a look on the tracks, so of course this is when the moon goes behind a cloud, and I heard another whistle followed by what I knew was footsteps on the train tracks. Me, being a dumb 12-year-old and figuring it might be one of my friends also heading to the party, called out hello. Complete silence. I chalked it up to imagination and continued, although now I was getting the heebies with a dose of jeebies on the side. I began walking faster. I was now maybe half a mile from the trestle, and suddenly I hear whistling again. I have no idea what the tune was, but it sounded demented. I called out again, "Stacy, is that you?" The whistling stopped, and what I heard next froze my blood. It was low but audible. It was a deep, gruff laugh. I took off running, and I realized that they were now running too. I could hear rocks and gravel falling from the tracks only a few yards to my right. I was crying now. Then I remembered that very soon would be a small trail that led from the trail I was on through the trees and brush up to the tracks. I almost screamed as if they knew my thoughts. I heard another laugh, low and deranged. I saw the connecting trail ahead and put my feet into overdrive. Just as I passed the trail, I could hear them leaping down the side of the tracks and feet hitting the trail, running at me. Now I did scream. This person, being whoever or whatever they were, was now hot on my heels. I even thought I could feel them swiping at my back, trying to grab me. I screamed again, full of complete terror. Then from in front of me I heard, "Cat? Is that you, Cat?" "Stacy," I screamed. Then I realized I could see a bit of the clearing ahead and a small campfire. But best of all people I knew. I covered the few yards and practically leapt at my friend. She thought I just got spooked from the long, dark walk in the woods. When I was able to calm down, I explained to them what happened, hoping maybe one of them was pranking me. And Stacy said that she hadn't seen anyone on the trail but me. Her boyfriend and one of his friends grabbed a flashlight and went out to check it out. Meantime, my friends tried to calm me down. A few minutes later, the guys come back. They were quiet and a bit pale. "Well," I asked. They looked at each other and then at us. And my friend's boyfriend said, "We didn't see anyone, but we found this in the center of the trail." From his pocket, he pulled out a gardening claw. My mind reeled when I realized that this is what I probably felt was swiping at my back. And he continued, "We could have sworn someone was whistling from back in the woods. Sometimes I wonder, what would the outcome have been if I had taken the train tracks instead of the trail?" It was March 2009. The events that had occurred that night happened roughly between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. I was 16 years old at the time, and my grandmother was in the hospital. Things weren't looking good for her, so my family from Australia had traveled over to stay with us in case she didn't get better. My house is fairly big, but with my family and my family in Australia, which consisted of my aunt, uncle, and 2 cousins, it was feeling pretty cramped. It was annoying having a little space to myself, but after this event I am thankful they were there. One night the lights were all turned out and everyone had gone to bed. Now my house has 3 levels to it. My room is on the middle level, and I usually spend a large amount of time staying up late on my laptop on YouTube or something. It was about 3 a.m. when suddenly there was a large bang at the front door. I had earphones in and I could hear this clear as day. It was so loud. The banging continued. Now this wasn't just a knock. This was a full force banging, as if the person wanted to knock the door down or break it. I leapt out of bed into the hall. My dad and my uncle met me in the hall, both completely baffled by what was going on. Now I was 16, but I'm a big guy and I knew I could take care of myself, as did they, so we ventured down the stairs. Our alarm is in motion detected, and once we reached halfway down the stairs, the alarm began to go off. Now the box to deactivate the alarm is close to the front door where this loud banging was coming from. My dad went over to the alarm and deactivated it and shouted through the front door to the intruder. "Who is it?" my dad yelled with an angry tone in his voice. With that, a car pulled into the drive and shone its light straight at the door full blast. Our door has small panels of glass, but you can't see clearly out of them due to the design in a peephole. The light from the car made it impossible to try to see anything out of the front door. We heard two men yelling something inaudible to one another. With that, I ran into the kitchen to grab a knife. My dad and my uncle stayed in the downstairs hall near the door in case someone tried to come in. As I grabbed a knife, I decided I should just double-check the back garden to make sure no one was there. Now I was actually expecting to see someone, so I had to brace myself. But when I pulled the blind back and saw two men running from the left to the right of my garden behind our conservatory and out of sight, I felt my heart drop. I took the knife and ran out, telling my dad what happened. That's when we noticed the car lights were flashing on and off, and the shadowy outline of a tall man could be seen out the door standing directly against the glass. He began kicking and banging the door down again. I honestly thought the frame of the door was going to cave in, it was so loud. My dad shouted that the police were on their way and that they should leave now before they get caught. My uncle had then moved from the hall to the dining room, to which you get a better view of the side of the conservatory. Thankfully, he got there just in time to see the foot of one of the men just disappear onto the roof. With that, he sprinted upstairs. My room was the room just above the conservatory, but there was no way to scale the side of the house after that, so my uncle thought they had to just jump back down. My two cousins were sleeping on the third level, and somehow one of the men got all the way up and began attempting to smash the glass on the big windows we had facing the sky. He was literally directly above them. They ran out of the door and my uncle ran up. Thankfully, the windows opened outwards, so with a huge push, my uncle sent the window flying open, knocking the man to one side on the roof. He scuttled to the edge of the roof and slipped slightly due to the heavy rain that was falling. He jumped into a tree we have at the side of the house in the garden, which is probably the only way he got to the roof. Back downstairs, about 4 men in total started shouting someone's name, asking for someone. I can't remember what the name was. My dad said that they have the wrong house, but they didn't leave him, and suddenly the car began beeping his horn and the men disappeared as quickly as they came. Everyone was on edge, but there was nothing more we could do in the dead of night in the rain, so everyone went upstairs. The following morning, after the police had come, we inspected the outside of the house. At first it seemed like it was only a few marks here and there from the damage done banging and kicking the doors and glass, but then we found smashed bottles with jagged edges carefully stashed in the bushes in the back garden. There was also a picture of the floor plans to my house that was slightly out of date, as it didn't have the conservatory added, but most strange was a picture of a family with a circle going across the face of a man who looked to be in his late 20s. At first I thought it was the previous owners, but then I remembered that our house has history in general, and these were definitely not the owners. Either way, they had the wrong house and the wrong family, but I hope the family in that photo are safe. When I was like 13 years old, my mother dragged my younger sister and I on a Disney cruise. I won't lie. At first I was extremely pissed about going, but it actually was cool. Something crazy happened to me while on the trip, though. One night my mom and sister were annoying the hell out of me, and I told my mom that I was going to the top deck to just look around. She told me to be careful and to come back in 20 minutes. I told her that I would, and when I got up to the top deck, I walked over to the railing and was looking down at the black ocean that was being cut through by our huge ship. As I was looking down, I saw what looked like a man that appeared to have fallen or something. He went by very fast and disappeared, but I thought I saw his arm come up at one point, and at the time I even thought I heard him make a noise. I saw his face for a split second, and he looked petrified, as I imagine you would be if you fell off of a cruise ship, and I started freaking out. I ran over to a woman and man that were talking and playing cards at a table nearby. They were wearing the ship's employee clothing, and I told them what I just saw. They both took it very seriously, and the man called for help on his radio. I explained to more employees, including the captain, what I saw, and they did an emergency passenger welfare check. My mom got called up to where I was, and a while later they told me everyone on the ship was accounted for. They pretty much made me swear on my life that I was sure and that I wasn't lying. At the time I told them I was sure, and 11 years later now I am just as sure I saw a man in that water. When I was really little, my parents would let me stay up late on the weekends and watch TV until I fell asleep. I really loved these times, and I would stay up later than anybody else just because I could. Well, one night I was almost asleep on the couch when I heard a noise on our front porch. It was the sound of our old-fashioned porch swing moving back and forth. I was a little scared, so I crept toward the bay windows of my living room and peeked out towards the porch. Everything on my front porch swing was an older woman, probably in her 50s, wearing nothing but a nightgown, covered in blood, and holding a huge kitchen knife. I flipped out immediately and ran screaming into my parents' room, but was too terrified to form words. My parents saw that I was upset, but when I finally was able to tell them what I saw, my dad got really angry and told me that it was just a dream and to go back to bed. I refused and kept crying and screaming until he had had enough and snatched my arm and dragged me towards the front door to prove that there was nothing there. I kicked and screamed all the way, trying to make him stop, but he kept pulling me. Suddenly we got to the door. He unlocked it, swung it open, and said, "See, there's nothing that—" To this day I have never seen the look of fear and shock that was on his face when that woman turned and stared at both of us and then slowly stood up with the knife. My dad slammed the door shut and got my mom to call the police while we went and got his gun. He went back to the door with a 12-gauge and cracked the door enough to stick the barrel out. He asked her what she was doing, and she said, "Somebody killed my husband." But it wasn't me. My dad told her that the police were coming, and she freaked out, grabbed the knife, and walked away. The police found her 15 minutes later, trying to break into one of our neighbors' houses. I haven't slept in the living room since. One of my favorite activities is exploring old abandoned buildings. I've seen quite a few strange things during these trips, but one experience still creeps me out to this day. A few years ago, I found a long-forgotten water refinery through the help of online exploration communities and Google Earth. Although it's stupid, I always go to places for the first time alone, partly for the thrill, and partly because if something bad were to happen, I would feel terrible having brought someone else into that situation. So I make plans to head there the next day after my classes let out. The day of the trip, I pack up my camera and water bottle and set off following my hand-drawn map. After an hour or two of biking, I finally arrive at the place, which luckily had an old bike path that dead-ended just past it. It was completely overtaken by vegetation, with trees growing up through and around the buildings. Not to mention that the actual buildings were just disintegrating, with paint peeling off every wall and ceiling. I took my time scouring each of the buildings, looking around for anything interesting. I found hundreds of broken windows, weird broken spheres, and some kind of giant oven. After an hour or two of successful exploring, I decided to head off happy with an SD card full of pictures. Soon after, I pulled my bike back out through the hole in the fence that I entered and started biking away. I remembered that there was one last shot I wanted to get. I'm pretty insistent on getting the shots that I want, and I didn't know if I would ever come back, so I decided to just tough it out, ride back, and take the picture. As I was going back, I saw a lone man dressed in old clothes walking down the bike trail away from the dead end. I thought it was kind of a strange path for someone to take a walk on, and something in me said, "Don't let him see you go in there." I biked past him and gave him a slight head nod, and figured that I would bike all the way to the end of the trail, turn around, and by the time I got back he'd be gone, having continued in the opposite direction. I leisurely take my time. I get to the end and turn around, and as I head back toward the hole in the fence, I see him there, staring at me, and walking back toward the dead end from which he came. He had a happy look on his face, but it wasn't the kind of happiness that made me feel at ease in any way. The best way that I could describe it is he looked like that he had just been told a very dirty joke and was trying to contain it. I knew I had to do something as I was literally trapped between him and the dead end. I decided to play it cool once more, but be ready to drop everything and run if things got hairy. As I get closer and closer to him, I can see his facial expression clearer, and he is not someone I want to be in the same state with, let alone the same bike path. I'm silently cursing myself for going back for one picture as I slowly get closer. Finally, I'm about 20 feet away from him and he calls out, "I sure would like a ride. It's so hot out. Mind if I jump on?" As soon as I hear this, I realize this is no longer my brain falsely interpreting something as creepy. I pick up speed and rush past him, putting as much space between us as I can. I now look behind me and see that he's once again turning around and following me. At this point, I bolt back to the road. Interestingly, I stop at a nearby gas station on the way home to get a refill on my Gatorade. I see a cop there and told him I just rode down the old bike path by this park. He looked at me, sort of bewildered as to why a person would ride out there, and he told me that he didn't recommend people go there, especially alone.